Welcome to the Learning Can't Wait podcast, a Full Mind production. At Full Mind, our vision is to ensure every child has access to an exceptional education. Each episode, we will be joined by pathfinders within and around the education space who are bringing about transformational change on behalf of deserving students. I am your host, Haley Spierbauer. Welcome back, everybody, to the Learning Can't Wait podcast. We are in season 11, and we are talking to a whole set of brilliant folk. And there is no one that I would better categorize as brilliant than this next guest that we have on joining us here today. We have Fleur Johnston, the founder and CEO of PeopleBench, joining us. Fleur, welcome.
Haley, hi. Thank you for having me.
It's so funny to interview someone who is on the exact opposite side of the world. For the guests listening, Fleur and PeopleBench were born in Australia. Were you actually born in Australia?
I was.
Okay.
I was born in Australia. Yes.
You were born in Australia, just like PeopleBench. And so when I was scheduling time for this meeting, I scheduled it on the wrong day because I just was struggling with the time zone change. So when we're recording today, right now at this time, it is 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard. But what time is it over there and where you are?
It is 7:30 a.m. in the morning, obviously. I made a mistake, Haley, so early in this podcast.
You know what? That's going to show our authentic self here because you and I had the good fortune of meeting about a year ago and immediately felt connected, both because the work that I'm doing at Full Mind and the work you're doing at PeopleBench is attending to a similar challenge that faces schools, but also because I think we were just really happy people to be where we were at the given moment that we met and had a really good fortune of Jess Millstone bringing us together. So Jess Millstone, thank you for this introduction because now Fleur and I have become fast friends and I've been a huge fan of the work that's happening at PeopleBench and I'm excited to dive in today.
Thanks, Haley. Me too.
So Fleur, can you tell everybody, how did you come to be the personal and professional version of yourself?
Yeah, well, and we were chatting a moment ago about where I was born. I was actually born in Tasmania, which is a tiny little island at the bottom of Australia. And just proving your earlier comments, we have to be friends forever now because I usually only tell friends that I was born in Tassie. In Australia, Tassie is the state where we should be most proud. We live right at the bottom of the country. We have the most pristine air and grass and wildlife. It's a beautiful place to be born. But it has in the past, particularly when I was born, 70s, it's a place that was quite separated from the mainland. And
Mm.
so, in a way, being born in Tassie and born to a mum who was a teacher, I had this experience of being around educators and in educational environments where people had to do more with less, and
Mm.
perhaps in spaces where they weren't as connected to others to get others' ideas, they had to be really inventive. So yeah, I was born in Tassie. I was raised in public education initially in Victoria and Queensland. So my family moved up the east coast of Australia as I grew up. And mum being a teacher was really significant. Early on, she was in secondary environments, and as we became older, she actually developed a fascination in early childhood. So by the time I was studying at university, I was also working a part-time job in the kindergarten environment, and I was sitting in the
Mm.
sandpit learning about, you know, logical consequence and all sorts of concepts in early educator environments while I was studying psych. And I was initially really interested in neuropsychology and eventually became really interested in organizational psychology. Went from those early environments in kindergartens, watching how incredible adults were creating contexts for students to learn and develop, to suddenly being in large public sector organisations. I moved into strategic HR and organisational development. My original sort of first full-time job was in the Department of Premier and Cabinet here in Queensland. And that was an amazing place at a state level to see how policy decisions were made. How we used data or didn't use data to inform policy, and how we used policy and process and procedure to try and shift how big public sector agencies were aiming to have an impact in the community. So there've been some of the threads for me, Hayley. I think right really early on, this idea of education as an environment that change and innovation can happen. And the fascination, I guess, with adult behavior in different contexts and how it drives impact in the community. Yeah, so that's how I accidentally ended up on the pathway that led me to founding and now running PeopleBench.
I am also very curious about why people do what they do.
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
adore that there's a whole field of study to think about the kind of context and interactions of human beings or adult human beings.
Mm.
You know this about me. It is like one of my weird, quirky curiosities. So I love that was one of the things we first bonded over, that this is a huge part of your background. And now you've taken a topic that is often applied to the business sector, right? Like talking about how companies can further their wealth acquisition and organize themselves in a fashion that is productive for long-term sustainability. And you've applied it into a field that is so often forgotten, which is education. So, can you talk about how these experiences shaped your path into education and workforce transformation?
Yeah. Yeah, like I say, my career started in public sector environments. So I actually had grown up in a really entrepreneurial environment at home. My father was a real entrepreneur. And so as a consequence, life at home was full of highs and lows. But mum was a teacher and she was stable and consistent. And so in my career, I absolutely promised myself I would never be an entrepreneur. And I leapt wholeheartedly into public service. And that really has been the theme. Even as I popped out the other end, becoming an entrepreneur and having to, accept that part of my identity, I kind of often feel like you can take the girl out of the service, but you can't take the service out of the girl.
Mm,
I didn't grow up in environments that were about hardcore commercial gain. I grew up in environments that were about social impact. And I
mm,
think that's why it was such a privilege to be part of the introduction of, systems, frameworks, tools, the evolution of originally the discussion was around knowledge management, but that then into information management and the rolling out of large quickly evolving technology across big systems at scale. How can we take those concepts and apply them in not-for-profit community impact environments where we also know in the larger context the world's ability to attract young and mature adults into those sectors so that they can operate sustainably and we can have teaching and we can have healthcare and we can have care for, whether it's aged care or disability services, any of those sectors where the work is to ensure better social outcomes. They're the ones I've always been fascinated by. And they're the ones which, to my mind, are this hugely untapped opportunity to do better than we have done
mm.
to date by taking some of those ideas, which you're right, have come from corporate environments, um, but which can be applied in pursuit of an outcome that is social. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, Haley, but
It does. Yeah,
that's
it
how
does.
I've
And like,
always thought about it. Yeah.
and it's so interesting to me because there are so many principles that you could say you could take from the business world and apply to social sector, but I think that the inverse is true as well. But
Yeah.
not everybody's always as open to listening or hearing that
Mm.
transferability of information or ideas or systems from education that can be applied elsewhere. But that's a
Mm.
podcast for another time. I want to talk
Another
about
time.
another topic, but before I do that, can you set the stage for us? What
Mm.
is PeopleBench? So you've obviously told us your story of how you got here, and your desire to be in social impact. How did you become an entrepreneur? What are you doing as an entrepreneur with
Yeah.
PeopleBench?
Yeah, so PeopleBench is a workforce analytics platform and strategy development tool. So after, the kind of environments that I had been in, I founded an advisory practice and we exclusively served, you'll be unsurprised, not-for-profits and government agencies. And very quickly schools were coming to us, particularly rural and regional schools in Australia, to say, hey, we're really having a hard time attracting and retaining staff, particularly at that time, 15 years ago. We're having a hard time attracting leaders. We've got people who are willing to be in classrooms, but no one wants to take the leap into leadership. So we initially started some work in the research space and consulting and advisory space, helping large systems of schools improve and mature their strategy and planning frameworks. So there were lots of systems we were working with at the time that didn't even have a strategic plan. And I'm sure you can reflect over the last couple of decades, we've really seen the process of strategic planning enter education more fulsomely. And then I guess the next challenge is once we've got a strategic plan, that's great. But if it's a dusty old plan that we all get excited about every 3 years and then shove on the shelf and get on with the day job, then it probably hasn't done much to help us change practice and therefore impact. So we got really interested in how can we take the data that schools and school systems already have and make that more usable for people who are never going to be organizational psychologists or data nerds like us because they're busy doing the critical work in the field of teaching and leading education. But how can we give them some of the data, some of the tools, some of the language, some of the professional learning to take those good ideas and apply them in a really appropriate context specific way in schools. So PeopleBench is a platform which helps harvest that data, which helps schools and districts come up with their workforce strategy, their plan for how they're going to make their schools a great place to work. And the tool just makes it very fast and easy to be able to develop the plan, track the plan, and modify our plans and behaviours if we're not headed in the right direction. And ultimately, what it does, it creates this reinforcing loop of the things that we are doing right, the things that are shifting the needle for us on retention and well-being for staff. And we're concerned about those things because when those things are tracking well, we know we get better outcomes for kids and communities. Yeah, so that's what we're working on, Hayley, and the path here, as you rightly point out, has been all about impact.
Mm.
You asked me a question about performance when we were having a chat earlier, and the concept of performance in schools. That's possibly another whole podcast and conversation too.
Have
But
a
when,
series.
yeah, let's do that. But when we're thinking about performance in schools, we're thinking about impact.
Mm.
How are the adults who show up to do schooling together able to have an impact, and how can we lever some of the factors which make it possible for the adults to be highly impactful? That really is the central question.
Yeah, no, that it is absolutely essential to answer that question, especially in the face of, you know, in the United States specifically, test scores are lower than they ever have been. The mental health of students is lower than it ever has been. It has a direct impact on the well-being of teachers and leaders. So I'm wondering, from your perspective and using all the data that you've collected, what are some of the most common challenges you see school leaders facing when they're trying to build sustainable and impactful workforces today?
Hmm. Um, I think if I think about what we see in both the Australian and the US context, overwhelm has got to be right at the top of the list. I
Mm,
mean, we have really watched the job of principal and the job of teacher, all jobs in schools,
hmm.
be redesigned almost by stealth. So by changing public and community demand and by policymakers' best efforts to, corral the resources and do better for the community, no matter the intention, I don't think in either context we can sort of deny the fact that the various decisions and pressures from outside of a school have, by definition, reshaped what it means to be a principal or what it means to be an educator in a school. And depending on whose research you look at, there'll be a heavy emphasis on an overly heavy administrative burden, too much time taken away from the actual task of teaching and learning. So as a leader in schools, when we look at the real challenges for them, I think the overwhelm of trying to juggle that change that has been mandated around them and then the pragmatic realities of what goes on in schools has been consistently difficult everywhere. I think in order to navigate our way out of that place, some additional challenges that we share internationally are the fact that we have lots of data that could improve our decision making, but we haven't been especially good at grabbing that data and then using it to make decisions.
Mm,
So missing data. And then if I sort of lean on our area of expertise and bias, not having a plan, not actually having a path forward beyond just get me a warm body for the classroom that needs
yeah.
supervision, which sadly is what we heard when we first started this work 15 years ago and what we still hear today. This pressure, the global supply crisis, and those numbers are staggering. It's actually experienced differently in different places. We work with plenty of schools and districts who say, we don't have a problem recruiting. We don't even have a problem retaining. But man, do we have a problem with burnout and psychological injury for the
Mm,
adults who show up to do work here. And man, do we have a problem with churn. So when we're working with larger public systems of education, we may not be net losing masses of teachers. But what we're seeing is churn. So
mm,
teachers that are moving from one school to another or from one class and year level to another, what that does is break and fracture relationships, especially when it happens in an unplanned and unscheduled way. And that would be another kind of trend, I think, that we've seen internationally over the last few years. Whereas previously, educators would tender their resignation for the following school year, and schools would be able to transition the relationships well, both the student parent relationships and the colleague relationships. Now we've got people who just
very
say,
different now.
I'm not
Yeah.
going to be in on Monday. And that is a hugely different impact on learning.
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
You know, you have this really unique global perspective doing this across two continents and really two halves of the world, two opposite halves of the world. But what kind of links all this together is that data. And you said that not everybody has the data and is using the data. And I know that you have a few research partners and are currently working on a few research projects. Can
Mm.
you share any insights from your research on how technology can improve staff retention and the experience of working at scale?
Yeah, well, and PeopleBench started as a pro bono research project. So I bootstrapped PeopleBench out of my former advisory practice when two really amazing leaders in education said, I am flying blind. I've got all of this data and I'm finding it really hard because actually, although I'm a system of 30 schools, 30 schools is still not a large enough data set for me to be able to make any inference from it. Um, Within my 30 schools, there's so much community diversity that I can't benchmark for myself. And that's where the bench in PeopleBench came from. We were
Mm,
trying to grapple with this idea that large data sets can exist in education just as they exist in other sectors. And we can make better use of those data sets. So when I think about the research that we've been doing with our university partners, I think first and foremost, the feedback that we get, whether it's through those formal research studies or something as informal as the first PeopleBench research study, the number one thing we get back from leaders is how useful it is to have
mm,
some data. Otherwise, they're operating mainly on intuition and gut feel. And we know that when, as leaders, we're operating on intuition and gut feel, and they're critically important. Like there is nothing as important as the hard-won expertise that develops over the decades of being a seasoned leader. There's just not. But even then, we're still really vulnerable to some of the normal decision-making biases that we see in organizations. Often in schools, we're prone to positivity bias. Sometimes in schools, we're biased to loudest voice. So we can have a small portion of staff who are particularly concerned about an individual matter, which may not be representative of the whole staff group, but which we might be called to act on in a particular way because they're loud. It's the whole squeaky wheel thing. So
hmm
when we look especially at things like teacher well-being, and we're especially interested in a phenomena around workplace resilience. So how can we bounce back from change and challenge and continue to perform our jobs to be impactful? When we look at resilience data, we can see that leaders often will take that data and break it down by cohorts. Before they collect their data, we'll say to them, in your school, who's struggling hardest right now? And they'll say, oh, and I can say this, Haley, because of my own demographic, it's my middle-aged women. They're
Mm.
tired. They're amazing educators, but they've been going and going, and they've got all this family stuff going as well. They're really tired and they need more support. And so the principal is often thinking about how do I support those, particularly women, to be in a better place and be more impactful. Sometimes, very often, we'll get their school data back, and it's actually their young men who are struggling hardest in the
Mm.
resilience data. And so that then provokes a different kind of conversation. It's not to suggest that those more mature women who also, not coincidentally, have better skills at advocating for themselves in the school context. It's not that they don't need support. We still need to maintain support on that track. But there was a quieter voice that needed elevating in the broader school diversity, the staff diversity. And that's the power of the data. So in the research, that's what we get back loudest. The thing that leaders value is tangible data that is quantitative to add to their qualitative assessment of what's going on inside of their schools. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I could nerd out about this all day. That is so fascinating. And like you said, not completely surprising when you think about the self-advocacy and also what are we talking about? I mean, this is maybe an assumption, and you can correct me if it's an incorrect assumption, but men are usually of the minority in a school setting. And so perhaps there's some level of acculturation happening too, where women feel empowered to have a voice, whereas in other settings, like the business world, that's the exact opposite problem happening.
Can be, yeah. And we sort of see all sorts of phenomena in the way we slice and dice the data, right? And so this is again the value of having data to be able to explore and examine. And just as schools internationally really have advanced their capability and capacity to analyze student data, the work that we're interested in is the companion piece, which says, and let's also look at the adult data, the
Mm,
staff data,
mm.
to see how together we can enhance the capacity to impact. And you touched on an important point, Haley, because there are many different metrics. The resilience metric has been a bit of a missing metric for some time, and it's been really great to add that to a cohort of data points. But measuring culture is something that we can do also. And part of the novel work that we've been doing in practice and in our research has been developing a K-12 specific language model of culture. The challenge with most culture models and most culture tools is that they are trained on language and data from big business and other industries.
Yeah.
Training a culture model which is exclusively developed using K-12 language has been a massive privilege. And we have an incredible data science team here at PV. I can't believe I get to work with these incredible folks. Jess Ross is our data scientist, and Mike Hennessy leads our research and insights team here. And they are just so terrific to work with. They work with the educators who have co-designed this model of cultural change in schools. And again, it doesn't prescribe tools and technology aren't the answer, they're the enablers. So they provide leaders with data about what in the culture is currently positive and what is negative, and how might we as a group of leaders or as staff collectively in the school want to see this change. Are we, for example, in the supermarket on the weekend saying, my school's a great place to work, you should come and work there too? Or are we, in the hallways saying to the students, do anything with your life, kid, but don't be a teacher?
Mm.
Um,
Which is,
and
so prominent in the data in America today. So,
right. Internationally,
yeah.
internationally, and these problems have been named. I guess the next challenge for us as a world is to go from naming the problems to taking action on them. And that's why the data is important, but that's also why a process is important.
Sure.
Um, yeah, and so we talked about strategic planning just briefly before. Cascading from a strategic plan, the idea of having a workforce strategy, a map for how we're going to make our school a great place to work is the other idea that emerged early in our work with schools. So the PeopleBench platform collects data, but it also has the tool to develop the workforce strategy and for a team to be able to do that quickly, have their plan, and then track their progress against it. Yeah.
You dug into so much there in describing this work and this research, and I feel so grateful. I have like the most kind of off topic but related question.
Mm.
So, a minute ago, you were sharing about this data, what leaders might assume is the population who needs support, but versus what actually is. And then I made an assumption about some of the culture issues that may contribute to men having less voice in, articulating concerns. I'm wondering, do you have a theory or a working theory about why it is, despite the larger number of women in education, the complete opposite paradigm with leadership, that men are more frequently promoted and sit in America like the superintendent seat? Have you thought
Yeah,
about this? Like, I think about this a lot.
yeah, no, I absolutely have. It's probably why I kind of stepped a little around your question. I'm sure you felt that a moment ago, Haley, because from my perspective, I always want to see the data.
Sure.
And we know in the data that men uh, ascend to leadership in education significantly more quickly and proportionately than women. And so the hypothesis that men aren't able to represent themselves in education is challenging to me. If that were true, we wouldn't see the progress
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah,
we're
yeah. I
seeing.
rescind
So I
my
don't.
earlier statement.
Yeah. And so, but, right, I think it's not as simple as gender. I think there's a complex intersection around a range of factors. Um, we know, for example, that we struggle to attract men to the sector, and we also then struggle to retain them at a higher rate in those earlier years than women. Now, some of that is just a numbers game, but without the data, I'd be cautious to suggest, why that phenomenon has happened.
Sure.
I'd be one of those people who'd put in a research paper, this warrants further investigation.
Yeah.
If I was to privately posit, then I think there's in particular an intersection between personality, for example, and selection into education as a career. And there are, just as there are subsets within women, there are subsets within men.
Sure.
And so we will see some people gravitate toward wanting leadership and advancement more than others. And I think gender is just one of the factors that contributes to that. Yeah, was that vague enough?
Oh my gosh,
Give
Fleur, but like
me
I,
data, give
again,
me more data.
I'm being so nerdy. This is again so interesting to me. And obviously we're talking about gender here, but there's other like you said, there's other factors that also could be easily studied, like race in America, race in other countries,
Right.
religion, like all these different factors, age. I'm going to just go down a rabbit hole after this podcast and start reading all the research on this topic because
Haley, what I will say is we know that we need diversity to drive innovation. And
yes,
we also know that we need representation for students to see themselves in the future. And
yeah,
so that stuff is well supported in the literature. And it doesn't matter whether we look at the educational literature or we look at the organizational psychology
yes,
literature, that stuff is thoroughly backed. So, to my mind, it makes sense. And that's part of why we built these tools, right? And it's why we do this professional learning. Um, it makes sense that as leaders in schools, we are being mindful about this. We are not being accidental about it. And we can name where we want to see the metrics move, whether that be on gender representation, cultural diversity representation. And here's one that challenges the sector, professional background representation.
ooh,
So, what we're seeing in schools, again, if reference that earlier point about jobs being redesigned by the policy environment and community
mhm,
demand, we know that over time, the proportion of teaching jobs in schools as a proportion of total jobs in schools is decreasing.
mm,
Now, that could be a terrible thing, or it could be a reflection of the fact that policy and community are asking different things of us. So, job redesign. And the types of job families and role types in schools is another area that we're doing a lot of work when we're working in our advisory practice. So when we think about schools in 20 or 30 years' time, what do we think they might look like? Well, we hope that they consist of job families and role types where the adults who are in those jobs feel like they have clarity around their roles, where they feel like they've been equipped on the way in and since they arrive with the right knowledge and skills to be able to do their jobs and be in their domain of power. And where collectively those professional disciplines are working to achieve the impact that we all want to have for kids and communities. And we can see that whereas that's perhaps been happening a bit by accident, and in schools, the experience of that has been in some cases brutal. The opportunity we all have is to get on the front foot and to be designing what we want this to look like and to move there mindfully and deliberately. So they're the things that we're researching, and the use of data, technology, process, and professional learning to make that possible is what we're hyper nerds about, in case that wasn't completely
I mean,
obvious.
I listen, you and me both. I'm like listening to it. I'm like, yes, say more, say more. Fleur, this is incredible. I know that we could probably spend hours on this call and on this podcast just talking through some of the other topics that get us going and why this work matters so deeply. But we are at time, so I need to ask you my final question, if you could believe it. I know, I know. My question for you, I normally ask you, well, what advice would you give a teacher starting their career
Mm,
today? But I
mm,
actually think I'm going to ask you a different question. I'm going to tweak it slightly and say, what advice would you give someone working at a district level who is
mm,
thinking about big questions related to workforce development today
mm.
in education? What would you tell them?
Find other people who want to solve this problem. I think, I wake up most mornings, Haley, wondering how it is I'm on this wild adventure. There was no point that I woke up and thought, I'm going to be a HR tech entrepreneur specializing in K-12 schools. That's just not a thing that happened. I think as someone at a district level with a passion and the responsibility to improve outcomes for kids and communities, and doing that through the mechanism of leading valuable uh, resources, whether that's financial or human resources, to make that dream a reality for the community we serve. Finding others who want to solve that problem with you, it will be critical to advancing your thinking. And whichever little piece of the puzzle you feel like you can be most impactful in, find others who can connect their piece of the puzzle with you so that together we can get it solved. Yeah, I don't know if that
That's
makes
so
much
brilliant.
sense,
No,
for
it
me,
does.
I feel like the puzzle solving will continue long after I've left the planet. But if each of us can come and try and bring our piece of the puzzle and connect it with others, I feel like we've got a really good shot at this.
Oh my gosh, I love it. Flora, you are so brilliant. It is such a pleasure to listen to you share and speak and opine and dive into topics I didn't tell you I was going to talk about. So, thank you for your grace and for coming on the podcast and talking about PeopleBench, but also our education system as a whole with me.
Thank you, Haley. Thanks for connecting us all. I really appreciate you giving us all the opportunity to bring our pieces of the puzzle.
Amazing. And thank you to everybody for tuning in today. Thanks for listening to the Learning Can't Wait podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and share this episode. Be the first to know when we have a new episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or have a suggestion for an episode, email us at podcast@fullmindlearning.com.